Tonight, we step not into battles or kingdoms, but into a world beneath the soil. A quiet, earthy world filled with forgotten flavors and textures. These are the vegetables once grown by medieval farmers, tended with rough hands and simple tools, harvested not for supermarkets, but for stews in stone hearths and bowls of healing pottage. From bitter greens served to knights recovering from wounds to root vegetables so hearty they fed entire families through frost and famine. These crops were once essential, and now most of us have never even heard their names. Have you ever wondered what people ate before the potato took over Europe? What grew in the shadow of castle walls and monastery gardens that has since vanished from our plates? What flavors, once as familiar as bread, have quietly disappeared from memory? Tonight, we dig them up, one by one, root by root, and let their quiet stories lull you into rest. If this gentle journey into the medieval garden calls to you, take a moment to subscribe to Little Historical. It helps a small channel continue to uncover the quiet corners of the past. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Sometimes our stories are too interesting for sleep, and sometimes we try to make them just boring enough for bedtime. Now dim the lights, turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let us cover what we have for tonight together. In the quiet soil of medieval Europe, before the potato ever graced the continent, there was Skirret. A name barely whispered today, yet once as common in cloister gardens and cottage plots as the leek or the onion. Skirret, Siam cicerum if you wish to be formal, was a root vegetable, pale and tender, with a naturally sweet, nutty flavor. It was beloved not for its size but for its subtle charm, and it was particularly prized in monastic kitchens where flavor had to come from the land, not from far-off trade. Unlike carrots which grow as a single taproot, Skirret forms a tangled cluster of slender roots, each about the thickness of a pencil. These white roots were peeled, boiled, or roasted, and often mashed into a kind of creamy, peppery paste. The flavor, though mild, had depth, something between parsnip and sunchoke, with an earthy sweetness that paired well with garlic, onions, and herbs from the same garden. In some recipes, Skirret was even candied like fruit or baked into savory tarts alongside cheese and eggs. But its charm extended beyond the plate. Skirret thrived in damp soil, especially in northern climates, and unlike some finicky vegetables, it did not demand much of the farmer. It was perennial, meaning it could return year after year, and it could be harvested well into winter, dug up from frozen ground when other crops had long withered. To the medieval farmer, this made Skirret not just delicious, but dependable. In many ways, it was the perfect peasant's crop. Yet it was not confined to poor tables. Skirret appears in royal records, too, including the garden inventories of medieval monasteries and manor houses. It was mentioned in herbals, praised for its wind-dispelling qualities and as a digestive aid. Even Henry VIII's gardener is said to have grown it in the royal beds. So what happened to this once-loved root? The arrival of the potato in the 16th century was part of its downfall. Easy to grow, easy to store, and higher in calories, the potato pushed many old vegetables to the margins. Skirret, with its delicate roots and need for peeling, was quietly forgotten. Yet beneath our feet the seeds of history remain, and sometimes they just need a little light to grow again. But Skirret was not the only green to vanish from memory. While it slept beneath the frost, another plant kept watch by the cottage wall, a humble perennial that asked for nothing and gave everything. Its name was Good King Henry, and it, too, has a story worth digging up. In the shadow of stone cottages and along the edges of fields, Good King Henry once reigned, not as a monarch, but as a plant. Known affectionately as poor man's asparagus, this perennial green was a faithful companion to medieval peasants, growing where little else would. Its dark green leaves and tender shoots offered nourishment year after year, needing almost no care in return. Today, few recognize the name. Yet in its time, Good King Henry was as vital as bread. The plant's name likely has nothing to do with royalty. Some believe Henry may come from old Germanic roots meaning home ruler, referencing its closeness to households and its dependable nature. Others suggest it was named after a local folk figure, a protector of the land. Whatever the origin, the name stuck, and the plant became a staple in peasant gardens across Europe, especially in Britain and the Alps. Its most prized parts were the young shoots, harvested in early spring and boiled like asparagus. Soft, slightly bitter, and deeply green, these stalks were among the first fresh foods available after a long winter. Later in the season, the large triangular leaves were picked and cooked like spinach, often stirred into potages, lentil stews, or rustic pies. Though not delicate in flavor, they were rich in iron and vitamins, an essential boost for hard-working farmers and their families. But good King Henry was more than just a food source. Its seeds were ground and used medicinally. Its roots were sometimes dried and stored. Even the ash of its burned leaves was used in early soap making. In an era where survival often depended on the utility of every plant, it proved its worth time and time again. Unlike modern vegetables which demand specific conditions and frequent care, good King Henry was low maintenance. Once planted, it returned each year without complaint. It could grow in poor soil, near stables, or along garden fences. Its persistence made it ideal for the medieval lifestyle, one that left little time for tending delicate crops. So why did it disappear? As spinach, chard, and asparagus became widely cultivated and standardized, good King Henry's rough edges made it seem outdated. Its slow germination, bitter taste, and coarse leaves lost favor with gardeners and cooks seeking refinement. But in its prime, it was a silent green ally, feeding the humble and enduring quietly. Yet even as good King Henry faded from the kitchen, another root was waiting in the frost, a vegetable so strange it was said to taste of the sea. Its name was Salsify, and its story begins where the garden meets the winter wind. Yet even as good King Henry faded from the kitchen, another root was waiting in the frost, a vegetable so strange it was said to taste of the sea. Its name was Salsify, and its story begins where the garden meets the winter wind. Among the frost-hardened beds of the medieval kitchen garden, there grew a root with a peculiar reputation. Salsify, often called the oyster plant, never saw the sea, yet its creamy white flesh was said to hold a taste faintly reminiscent of oysters, especially when boiled in milk or roasted with herbs. To the modern ear, that might sound curious, even suspect. But in a world without mass refrigeration or global food imports, Salsify was a prized winter delicacy. This humble root, long and slender with a tough, hairy skin, thrived in cooler climates and poorer soils. It was planted in early spring and left to grow slowly through the summer. By the time winter rolled in, its flavor had deepened and sweetened, becoming most potent after the first frost. This frost, far from being a threat, was actually welcomed. It signaled that the Salsify was ready to harvest, tender and full of flavor. For the medieval cook, preparing Salsify required patience. The roots had to be scrubbed thoroughly, peeled, and soaked in water to prevent discoloration. Once prepared, they could be boiled, stewed, or mashed like parsnips, or used to thicken soups and stews. The texture was soft but satisfying, almost silky, and the taste, though mild, brought a subtle complexity to otherwise bland winter fare. Beyond its culinary uses, Salsify also held a place in herbal medicine. Monastic herbals described it as a remedy for snake bites, liver ailments, and even melancholy. Its milky sap was thought to have purifying properties, and its leaves, while not as commonly eaten, could be fed to livestock when food was scarce. Despite its value, Salsify was never as widespread as turnips or onions. It remained somewhat of a niche vegetable, grown in smaller patches or in gardens attached to monasteries and manor houses. Its labor-intensive nature and delicacy made it less ideal for mass cultivation. And when newer, hardier vegetables like the potato arrived, Salsify was pushed to the fringes of European agriculture. Today, you might still find it in heirloom gardens or tucked away in seed catalogues, but few remember its place in medieval life. Yet for generations long gone, Salsify brought a touch of refinement to rough winters. A quiet reminder that even in the hardest seasons, nature offers something tender, if you are willing to dig for it. But the garden held even stranger treasures. There was a plant so tall it was called a green sentinel, and a fruit that had to rot before it could be eaten. The next root in our quiet chronicle is one of the most peculiar of all, the medlar, a fruit that taught medieval people that beauty sometimes hides behind decay. But the garden held even stranger treasures. There was a plant so tall it was called a green sentinel, and a fruit that had to rot before it could be eaten. The next root in our quiet chronicle is one of the most peculiar of all, The medlar, a fruit that taught medieval people that beauty sometimes hides behind decay. The medlar is perhaps one of the most misunderstood fruits ever grown in medieval Europe. It resembled a small, brown apple with an open, star-shaped bottom, often earning it the crude nickname open arse in Old English texts. But beyond its odd appearance was a fruit that held a cherished place in medieval cuisine and culture. Unlike most fruits, the medlar had to undergo a process called bletting, a kind of controlled rot, before it became edible. And when it did, it transformed into something soft, sweet, and richly flavored, like spiced applesauce with a touch of wine. Medlar trees were slow-growing but sturdy, thriving in cooler climates. They were often planted near monasteries, manor orchards, or tucked into the corners of kitchen gardens. The fruit was harvested in late autumn, long after apples and pears were gone, and then stored in straw or on windowsills until it softened. This made the medlar a valuable winter treat, a rare sweetness when most other fruits were long gone. Medieval cooks understood the art of patience, and the medlar rewarded those who waited. Once bletted, the fruit could be eaten with a spoon straight from its skin or mashed and served with cream, wine, or cheese. It also found its way into jellies, sauces, and festive tarts. Some wealthier households added medlar preserves to their winter feasts, pairing the fruit with roasted meats or mulled wine. But the medlar was not just culinary. It held symbolic meaning, too. Poets and playwrights used it as a metaphor for aging, for hidden sweetness, and for things that appear unlovely but contain beauty within. Shakespeare mentioned it more than once, often with a wink of earthy humor. It was, in many ways, the perfect medieval symbol. Humble in appearance, slow to mature, but full of depth and richness when treated with care. Over time, as new fruits like oranges, peaches, and bananas reached European markets, the medlar lost its place. Its requirement for ripening after harvest made it unfashionable in the age of convenience. But in its day, the medlar was a fruit of contemplation, one that reminded medieval people that time, decay, and patience could yield surprising rewards. And perhaps that beauty does not always look perfect at first glance. So as we close this chapter of forgotten flavors, let the medlar's quiet lesson linger, that even in the strangest, most unassuming forms, the past has left us gifts worth remembering. And with that, the garden grows still, the hearth cools, and sleep may finally find you.